What's up everyone, Nader here. In this video, I'd like to go over a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with styles and classes in the DOM using JavaScript together. What we're going to do is go over a warm-up exercise plus 3 different exercises that get progressively more challenging so that we can really get a good understanding of how styles as well as classes work in the DOM. We can actually use these methods later on when we're working with more complex topics like web components or even frameworks in the future like React. Let's get right to the exercises. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's a warm-up and a couple exercises here. I have these up on GitHub as well, so feel free to go over there in the description to actually grab them, or you can just pause the video and kind of just follow along. I'll give you a chance to do that, and we'll go through a potential solution together for each of these. So for the warm-up exercise, I want you to create an HTML file with a head with a title in it, and a body tag with an h1 tag in it that has some text inside the h1 tag. Then I want you to open this file in your browser just by double clicking on it and open up the dev tools alongside it as well. And I want you to figure out what are 2 different methods or ways you can use to change this text, I should mention, in the h1 tag, right, to be white with a black background. Okay, so this h1 tag's text, white text on a black background. And I want you to both confirm this visually, which should be pretty obvious when you make that change in the DOM, but also in the actual elements tab in the actual markup as well. So give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let me create a new file here. I'll just call this warmup.html. Right here, I'll just create my doc type HTML. I'll create an HTML. I'll create a head. In the head, I'll create a title. I'll just call this warm-up exercise. And then after the head, I'll do a body with an h1 tag inside of it. And I'll just say, welcome to the warm-up exercise. Let's go with that. All right, and I'll save that, and Prettier will format that nicely for me by inserting a bunch of new line nodes, which is fantastic. So let's go ahead and open this up in our actual browser. So I'm going to right click on this, reveal in Finder. I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit. I'll double click on my warm up, and there we go. So let me zoom in on this super far so we can actually see the styles take effect once I actually change that. And over here we have our head, we got our body, here's our h1 tag, and the goal is to figure out 2 different ways to actually change this to be a white text on a black background, so pretty much the exact opposite of what it is right now. So the first method I want to show you is by kind of changing the attribute for the style attribute directly using set attributes. So let's try that out. So I'm going to actually select this to make sure I can easily use it in the future. So I'll just say const h1 equals document.query selector. Maybe I can zoom in a little bit more here of the h1 tag. And then if I have my h1, there it is, and I have access to my h1, which is fantastic. Now I can always just use this handle, so you don't have to keep watching me select it with the query selector. So I can say h1 dot set attribute, and I can set the style attribute, which we saw in the attributes video, to be whatever I want. So in this case, let me just close this off so that we can kind of focus on what we want to put in here. I want to put some CSS in here for what this style will be. And these are just single rules, one at a time, separated by semicolons when you're actually doing it using inline styling. So I'm going to say the color of the text is going to be white. And then I want the background color, and keep in mind here that when we're using CSS inline like this or in a CSS file, we kind of have this like kebab case going on, right, with the skewer in between, and we're not using camel case, right, because CSS doesn't use camel case. So we'll see the differences here when we use different methods shortly. So for the background color here, I want this to be white text, and then background, let's do black. So I'm going to put a semicolon actually here as well, just to make sure that's correct. And I'm going to count to 3, and let's see what effect this has when I actually press enter. So 1, 2, and 3. And there we go. So that actually worked, right? So if I switch back to the elements tab here, what we'll see is that now I've added an inline style attribute of exactly what we just set as that string, which is pretty nice. So that's cool. So I'm actually just going to set that style attribute now to be nothing to switch it back, right? And that's fine. I could also just remove attribute style. That would be another way to actually do it. But for now, an empty string is fine as well. So Let's see if we can actually change this using another method. So this is one way to do it. The other way to do it is by saying h1.style, using the actual property on the style, like a property and object of this actual DOM object, right? So I can say .color, and I can set this equal to white. And if I do this, what we'll see is actually the text should disappear because I haven't changed the background yet, right? So I'm going to press enter here, 1, 2, and 3, and there we go. So it's disappeared, right? But it is here. You can see if I highlight it, and the text magically shows up, right? Because it's white. And I can do the same thing. I can say h1.style.background color, and notice that this is camel case, right? Because we can't have kind of kebab casing with our property names on an object in JavaScript, so we have to actually use camel case here. And here I can say I want the background color to be black, and then there we go. If I press enter, we can actually see the exact same result as before. And interestingly, if I switch back to the Elements tab, lo and behold, the style attribute has actually been changed back to what it was before as well, which is the synchronization between the property and the attribute tags, which is pretty cool. All right, I hope that made sense. Let's take a look at the next exercise together. So for this one, kind of for most of these, we're going to be creating these HTML files. So I'll just kind of go through all these again, but they differ quite significantly beyond that. So for this one, again, an HTML file, right? It has a head, a title, put some text in it just so that we can kind of have that semantically there. A body tag with an h1 again with some text inside the h1. We're going to be manipulating that from this file. So what I want you to do in this one though is I also want you to add a style tag, okay? That's going to target elements with a class of large, all right? And it's going to change anything that has a class of large to have a font size of 48 pixels. Right? And you can put the style tag in the head, right? Then again, I want you to open up the file in your browser, just like we saw us do with the warm-up exercise. And I want you to think of a couple ways that you can actually add and remove this large class to and from, I guess, respectively, from this h1 tag, right? So as we add it, we should see the font size change, or the text, like the text size of the font to change to be really large. And as we remove it, it should go back to its default value, whichever that is for the browser and the operating system. All right, so try a couple of different methods to see if you can get that working. And again, as usual, verify that visually, but also in the actual DOM Elements tab as well. So give that a shot, and then we'll go through it together. All right, so I'm going to create a new file here. I'll call this exercise-1.html. I'm just going to copy this here for my warm-up just so you don't watch me type for too long. I'm going to switch this to be exercise 1 here. And I'll just say, welcome to, I guess, I don't know, to exercise 1. Doesn't really matter what text we have in here. We're just going to be changing that for the exercise. That's all we're doing. So I'm going to right-click this again, open it in my Finder. There it is. I'll double-click on it, and we should have that pop up. So I just want to kind of mention, I'm already zooming in on this, right? So if I inspect this element, what we'll see is that it has a font size of 2em. Actually, let's see what that actually ends up being. Font size 32 pixels, right? So yeah, so I guess if I yeah, so to 32 pixels for the font size, which is actually quite big. So I'm going to be changing it to 48, so it'll be slightly bigger than this. And I'm also zoomed in, so keep that in mind. This is actually not 32 pixels at its normal size. I'm zoomed in right here, like 300%, right? So just keep that in mind as we go through this together. So our goal is to actually add a class to this, and I forgot to do this with a style. So let me actually go back in here and add that style. I got too carried away with actually opening that up right away. So I can put that before or after the title. It shouldn't actually matter. I'll just put it before here. So I want to say anything that has a class of large, right? So the selector for classes in CSS is the dot, right? Or the period. And I'm going to say it has a font size of 48 pixels. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to switch back to my Chrome here. I'm going to just reload this just so that I can make sure that it appears in my style there. And it does. And there shouldn't be any change, right? Because I haven't actually applied this yet to my H1 tag, right? So notice that it's still, if I go to the computed tag, which is kind of the get computed styles from the cascade, it's still 32 pixels. Okay, so if I go back to my console here, let's do the same thing. I'm going to do const h1 equals document.query selector h1, just like that. I think it was in my history, so nice and easy right there. And if I do my h1 here, what we'll see is welcome to exercise 1. If I highlight over it, we'll see that selected. Perfect. Now, we want to see if we can add a class to this in a couple different ways. Right? There's actually a few different methods, more than 2 for sure. But let's just go through kind of 2 of the slightly more quote unquote common ones. So I'm going to say h1.className, right? And if I look at that right now, it's empty. But I can actually set this to be any string that I want. And this is going to be the class for that element. So now if I say large, let's see what actually ends up happening. So watch this text here. Let's see if it actually changes size. All right, I'm going to count to 3, so it's a bit more obvious. So 1, 2, and 3. And there we go, right? So it got quite a bit bigger. If I switch back to my Elements tab here, we can see that now the font size is 48. Again, I'm on the computed tab here, and you can see that it actually is being applied here as well with this new .large class, which is at the highest priority, which is pretty awesome, right? And the computed style right here, again, 48 pixels. What we can also see is that class now has been added as an attribute with a value of large, which is fantastic. So that makes sense. Okay, so let's just do h1.remove attribute, and I'll remove the attribute of, let's just say class for now. And if I do that, we'll see that it switches back to the regular size. And what's another way that we can do this? Well, we can do h1.classList, and that'll give us a list of the classes. And you can see right now there's nothing in there. This value is just showing up, I believe, from Chrome. And I want to add a new class, and this makes it easier so I don't have to always rewrite the class here, because this is actually setting it to be that value directly. So if there was anything else in there previously, we have a risk of erasing it unless we're doing string concatenation. Right? So in here, I want to add a large as a class name to this list of classes. And in theory, the DOM API should actually take this and add it to the class list or remove it, which we'll see shortly. So I'm gonna count to 3 here. So 1, 2, and 3. And there we go, right? So there it is. If I switch back to my Elements tab, it's back to 48 pixels, and it has a large class as well as the attribute of large, which is great. And as you can imagine, we can do .remove, right? And that's effectively the same thing as removing the attribute, and it is now gone from that list of classes, and we have back to our normal size. Now, there's a few other ways to do this as well, as you might imagine, but this definitely is probably one of the easier ones. I would really recommend using class list because it's just a really nice way to actually add and remove classes without really clobbering the other ones that were there previously. The API is a little bit funky, I guess, with add and remove. I guess we're probably used to things like push and things like that from the JavaScript API for arrays, but it's not too bad, and it kind of matches some of the other DOM APIs as well. Okay, so hopefully that one makes sense, right? So a couple ways to add and remove that from the H1. Let's take a look at exercise 2. Okay, so for this one, very similar, but definitely some differences. So bear with me as we go through this, because there is enough hopefully here to actually compare and contrast to the previous exercise. So step 1 is the same, right? HTML file, head, title in there with some text, a body tag with an H1 tag inside the body that has some text in it, just like we saw. Again, open it in your browser, open up the DevTools alongside it so that we can actually write some code in it, as we've seen. Now, the difference here is I want you to not add a style tag in the HTML, okay? So at least right away, right? So in the HTML, like we had over here, you saw we had this style tag. I want you to not have this in there to start, right? So I'm actually gonna copy this and we'll delete that in a second. What I want you to do is in the console of the developer tools, I want you to figure out how would you add your own style tag from scratch, right, to the head element that's going to target elements with a class of large and change their font size to be 48. So effectively, what I'm saying is I would like to basically create this exact element right here from scratch using the DOM node creation API that we've seen in previous videos. Okay. So that's the goal. And then I want you to also add the large class to the H1 once you have the style tag inserted into the DOM to confirm that it actually works as expected. Now, this is pretty cool because we're doing everything in this case dynamically through the DOM API through JavaScript. So a bit more challenging. Again, once you have it done, verify that it works both visually and in the Elements tab of the DOM to make sure it works, and flip back and forth as you add and remove this to make sure it makes sense to you. So give that a shot and then we'll go through it together. All right, so I'm going to create another file here. Let's do this exercise. I guess I can just copy and paste, but I'll just do it this way, 2.html. And I'll come in here and I'll copy all this text from my exercise 1 and I'll paste it in here. And I'm actually just going to kind of comment this part out right here. All right, just so that we can see that that's kind of what we want to create, but it's not going to be showing as an actual style tag in the DOM because it's commented out. So it's just a comment node. Okay, so the comment starts right here and ends right here. You can also just totally delete it if you don't want the comment there. I'm just going to use that as a reference for myself so I don't forget what I have to put in there. Okay, so this is actually exercise 2 in this case. Welcome to exercise 2. And there we go. So I'm going to right click on this reveal in my Finder, double click on it to open it here in my Chrome, super zoom in. I like my 300% here, nice and big so we can all see, and open up my Elements tab and we can see everything in here, right? So style is not being applied as we can see. If I scroll down and I click the H1 tag and I click the computed properties, we can see that font size here is 32 pixels, right? So this 48 pixels is not being applied. There's no large element style here on this actual H1 tag. All right, so let's figure out in the console how we can do this. So we need to do what, right? Let's think about this. If I switch back to VS Code here, we need to create this style tag from scratch, insert it into the head of the DOM. Then we need to add that class to the H1 and make sure that it actually applies this large class style of font size 48. So let's start with this part right here. Let's actually create our style tag and see how that might actually work. So if I switch back to Chrome, I'm just going to say const, let's do style equals document.create element. And I want to create a tag, a style tag in this case. And now if I take a look at style, what we'll see is it is an empty style tag, which is pretty cool. All right, now let's see, what do we want to do here? Well, we want to make sure that the text inside this tag is effectively this text right here, right? So let's see if we can do that. So how do we change the text inside of an element? Well, there's inner HTML, but generally I mentioned that you don't really want to be using that. And in this case, we don't actually need it because we're not parsing any HTML. This is actually CSS. So one way we can do this is using text content. So let's try that to see what happens. So if I switch back here, I'll say style dot text content. Right now it's empty. There's nothing in there. I want to set it to be a new string. So what do I want to do? Well, I want to style all of the, in this case, things that have a class of large. So that's dot large. I'm going to do a space and then some curly brackets. Now we're probably used to doing something like this where we have, some kind of spacing in here. It's not absolutely necessary. I'm just going to show you that you can also just do this all in one line and it would work just fine just for sake of difference. So in here, I'm just going to say, well, everything that's large, I want to have a font dash size of 48px, just like that. and I'm going to put a semicolon there as well. You can put some spaces here if that makes you feel better. And again, you can put some, I think you can put some new lines, at least in the console. Maybe not, you might need to check me on that. I think it depends as well which browser you're using. So in this case, we're saying the text content. So the text in between these tags is going to be .large, basically just this string. All this is a regular string. It's just basically formatted as CSS in this case. So I'm going to press enter. And now if I look at my style tag and I press enter, what we'll see is that lo and behold, it has this correct text inside of it. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'm liking that. I really like that. So I'm going to clear my console here just so that it's more space for me. So now I need to insert that into the head, right? And I can put this before the title or after the title, doesn't really matter. I'll just do an append for now just to keep things simple. So I'm going to say document, and we have a shortcut to the head using document.head, just like that. I'm going to say .append, where we can append a node to the head. And I want to append that style node, which is the one I just created, which has the text content inside of it. So before I do this, I want you to take a look at this, right? I have this style comment in here, the title, and that's it in the head. Now, if I execute this line of code, press enter there, nothing happens, right? Because we don't have any styles applied to this yet for large. But if I switch to my elements tab, look at that. We have effectively this comment, right, which we created before, in here, .large font size of 48 pixels. The spacing is a little bit wonky, but that is fine. It's still valid CSS. So if I switch back to my console here, now let's toggle that class onto this actual element and see if it works. So I'm going to say document.query selector. I'm going to grab this H1. I'll actually store this in H1 just so that it's easier. There we go. So that's our H1, right? H1.classList.add, and I want to add the large class to see if this actually works. Okay, so fingers crossed. If this works, what we're going to see is this large font size applied to this element right away. So 1, 2, and 3, and there we go. Now that is pretty cool. Right? So let's switch back to our elements tab. Take a look at this. There's our class attribute added to the H1 just like before. Look at that. There's a large class down here, font size 48 pixels. Oh, and I just realized that I was actually covering my face here. Or my face was covering this when I was actually showing you these pixel sizes before. But the font size here, if you switch to the computed properties, will actually be 48 pixels. For the font size, and I could probably scroll this like right under my face there and you can actually maybe see it. But once you pull it up, you should be able to see it. But most importantly, it's right here as well. So that's pretty awesome, right? And we can remove this as you might imagine. I can just do .remove large, and then that will actually change it as well. Okay. So that is pretty awesome. We did all of this dynamically, right? We literally created a style tag from scratch, put in the text content of it, actually inserted it into the DOM, and then toggled the class on other elements inside the DOM to match that style tag. Pretty darn cool. And just to really kind of show you a little bit of a bonus here, if I do document.stylesheets, what we'll actually see is that this style sheet is now actually in there. And if I open that style sheet up, which is just the 0th style sheet, because this is a list of all the style sheets that are on this document, and I open up the CSS rules here, and then I open up the first rule, we can see that it has text of .large, and the selector is a class of large, and it's applying the font size of 48 pixels to that element, which is pretty awesome. Cool. So that is exercise 2. I hope you found that one interesting. Let's take a look at exercise 3 together. All right. So this one, switching it up a little, definitely quite challenging. So bear with me as I give you a bit of an explanation as to how this one works. So I'd like you to create an HTML file here with a head with some title and some text as usual. And then I want you to create a body tag that's empty to start, and then just add a script tag inside of it that has no text, just to kind of get this boilerplate code down, right? So head, title, body, and then just a script inside of it that has no script text. Then open it in your browser, make sure you have everything set up, your dev tools on the side, and kind of no text. It should be pretty empty. And once you are ready, then what I'd like you to do is using only JavaScript code inside of that script tag that's inside the body, right? I want you to add a div tag to the page that has a background color of salmon, right? And is centered horizontally on the screen with a size of 200 pixels by 200 pixels. So effectively, what this is going to be is a square that is kind of the salmon pinkish color. That's a div that is colored in the middle of the screen horizontally. Okay, so it's going to be in the middle top of the screen, 200 by 200 pixels. Okay, and I want you to do this using only JavaScript code and the DOM APIs inside of this script tag. So don't manually code any kind of styling or div tag inside HTML or CSS. Do this all through JavaScript and these APIs. And then again, as usual, visualize these in the actual browser as well as in the DOM to make sure it's actually doing what you expect it to do once you reload the page and actually take a look at the elements in there. So give that a shot, a bit more challenging, then we'll go through it together. All right, so I'm going to create a file here. I'll call this exercise-3.html. I'm just going to, let's just copy this one actually, why not? I'll copy my second one, paste it in here. I'm going to get rid of the style. I'm going to say exercise 3. I'm going to get rid of the h1 here. I'm going to change this to a script tag. And that's going to be an empty script tag for now. I'm going to open this up in my browser and make sure I opened up the wrong file. That was my JavaScript file that I opened up. Let me just make sure I open up the, where was it? exercise3.html. That's the one I want to open up. So there should be nothing in here, except if we open up the actual elements tab, what we should see is kind of this empty script tag in here and the title correctly showing. So that's pretty great. Okay, so let's switch back here. So the goal here is to see if we can kind of get a div added to the screen and then kind of add some styling to it, as well as making sure kind of it's centered on the screen. Now, I know centering a div, it's kind of this joke that everyone has. It's very, kind of tricky and annoying to center these divs. Now, there's probably like dozens of ways to center this div, to be completely honest with you. I'll leave it up to you to decide which kind of way you want to go with. I'm just going to go with the simplest possible CSS, because CSS, frankly, also kind of scares me a little bit because I'm not that great at it. I just know enough to be slightly dangerous, dangerous being the keyword there. But if you want to get really fancy with this, with the CSS, you definitely can. But I'll keep it super simple so we can focus on the actual DOM APIs and the styling and classes. So let's just kind of get a div started up, right? So I'm going to switch back to my HTML here. So inside the script tag, what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to say const div equals document.createElement, and I want to just create a div. So this is going to give me an empty div. Okay, so then I can technically insert this into the body. So let's see if that works. I'm going to say div, not div.body. I'm going to say document.body.append, and I want to see if I can append this div. And I'll save this, and I'll switch back to my Chrome here, and refresh my browser. And look at that. I have my div actually at the bottom right after my script tag inside the body. So that's pretty good, right? So we have a div tag in there and that's working as expected. That's pretty dandy. Now we want to actually see if we can kind of add some styles to this to actually get it centered and colored on the screen. Okay, so this part already is kind of some elements generation going on. And, the more that we're doing this, the more you probably should be thinking behind the scenes of like, maybe this makes sense to be like a function, right? Like maybe I want to create a function to create these elements, and that'll become a bit easier so that I can kind of create different types of elements instead of always doing this kind of inline. But for now, we'll just kind of do it inline just so we can see all the steps one at a time together. So what are some ways that we can actually style this thing so that it's centered on the screen? Well, I can do div.style, and let's give it a margin of auto. Okay, and if we do that, in theory, this should actually kind of, I believe, center it with the margins auto property. And then what we can do is I can say div.style.margin dot height is equal to 200 pixels. Now you want to be really careful when you're applying these styles like this through JavaScript. We need to make sure we're using the units like EM or rems and all that kind of stuff. In this case, pixels, because if you just set it to be 200, for example, that's pretty ambiguous. And the browser is actually just going to ignore this rule, which I can actually show you once we do this in a second. So I'm going to do the same thing, but for width. So I'm going to say width is equal to 200 pixels as well. Again, making sure the unit is there. Now, this is kind of interesting. And I kind of did this on purpose just so you can see kind of what's happening. I'm actually appending an empty div here, and then I'm changing the styles of the div. So the question is, well, is this even gonna work, right? Like, does this kind of like invalidate the fact that I'm changing styles after? Can I still access this element after? Let's take a look, right? So if I switch back to Chrome over here and I reload this page, take a look at that, right? I have my div and it's got all these styles applied to it. Margin auto, height 200 pixels, width 200 pixels, which is pretty awesome. And it's centered in there. As you can see, is that little blue box, and then the orange ones are the actual margins. So that's pretty great. And you can see that the styles are actually applying correctly right here, right? So the margin is right there. This is the height, and the width are being applied as well. So all we're missing now is the actual color. So let's see if we can get that working. I'll switch back to my console over here, or my VS Code, I should say. div.style.background color is equal to salmon, right? One of my favorites. And I'll save that file, switch back here, and reload the page, and there we go. Right? It is actually on the page right in the middle, right? So if I was to actually move this around, as you can see, it actually maintains its spot right in the middle of the page, which is pretty great. So that works pretty well. And you can see that the color is being applied down here as well. Now, I just want to show you what I was talking about with the units. So if I actually switch back to VS Code, and for example, I get rid of these pixels right here. So I just say 200 and I save that, and I switch back here and I refresh the page. Notice that it actually doesn't work correctly because the browser is not sure what units we're using, and it's actually just going to ignore that styling rule completely. So be really careful when you're applying these unit-based styles through JavaScript because you can have unintended consequences like this if you forget them. So I'm actually going to put those back in here. And the other question is, well, what if I was to kind of take this append and add it here? Is that going to make any difference, right? So let me try that. I'll save it. I'll switch back here, refresh the page, and it looks like it works the same as before, right? So really quick here, to wrap up this video, I just want to kind of mention what's going on here, just step by step. We're creating a div element, and we're getting a handle to that div element right here, calling it div. Okay, we're changing some style properties or attributes on this actual node element, which is this element right here, which is live. If I was to append this at the end, we would just take everything with the styles applied and apply it into the DOM right away. If I had this up here instead, what we're saying is insert the div first into the DOM without any styles applied, and then apply all these styles, because this div is still the actual element is still a handle to the same element, just now it's actually inserted into the DOM, right? So it's technically doing this so fast that we actually can't really tell a difference either way that this was working. And there would be some circumstances where maybe there would be a slight flicker and delay. So generally what you want to do is, if you know what you're going to be applying as styles and attributes and all that kind of stuff to an element, you kind of want to bulk create all that stuff up front and then append it to the actual DOM, kind of like what we had over here in this case, okay? Now, again, it really depends. It's sometimes going to cause issues, most of the time not cause an issue. So I'll leave it up to you. But generally speaking, this, I would say, is probably a little bit cleaner and easier to understand as to what is actually happening. Awesome. So I hope you found this video valuable and these exercises fun and interesting. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, I'm super excited. We're going to get into a really wonderful set of topics about events and browser events and how they work in the DOM on these different elements. We're going to start with an introduction into that topic and go through a whole bunch of different event types and event listeners and all that kind of fun stuff to get us prepared for future topics on events where we can go a bit deeper. I can't wait to get to that video. I'll see you in that one. See you later.